So I'll start with introducing Rohan, who is joining us from Mumbai and who is an architect, urban designer, and filmmaker practicing in Mumbai. Rohan is the Dean of the Architecture course at the Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies. He's also a principal of the Architectural and Urban Practice, the Collaborative Design Studio, and is a member of CRIT, an urban research collective based in Mumbai. Rohan's work ranges from architecture, urban research, and consultancy projects to works in film and visual art. He's interested in issues concerning housing, public space, and in exploring the many ways of reading and representing the city. Rohan has worked on many research and consultancy projects in the city of Mumbai in collaboration with governmental and non-governmental organizations, including projects like the Churchgate Revival Project and the Tourist District Project. Through the school, he has worked on research projects in Dharavi and the spaces of Dr. Ambedkar in Mumbai. Rohan is the co-editor of the publication on an interdisciplinary research and art collaboration project, Cinema City. He also curates film programs and writes on cinema, architecture, and urban issues. He's also made films on art, architecture, and urbanism, including Nostalgia for the Future, Lovely Villa, which we all have seen, and Squeeze Lime in Your Eye. And so it's very lovely to have you on board, Rohan, and also very nice to have colleagues from film and photo joining us across disciplines today, which is really lovely to have this opportunity to bring people together. I will introduce Julien as well. So Julien worked as a freelance broadcast journalist for years before starting his PhD in English literature, supported by architecture. Julien was a foreign correspondent in Berlin, a reporter in London, a documentary maker in Paris. So I think also some links to the moving image. Julien has experience in front of the camera, but is most interested in voice and words. He holds master degrees in modern language from the University of Tübingen and in creative writing from the University of Oxford. Along his PhD, Julien works with Arab's Foresight team, where his focus lies on future cities and the social value of place. So we thought to start with your presentation, Julien, and that would then be followed by Rohan with the benefit of bringing, I think, both of your notions, ideas, and inputs on home together in this way. So thank you very much once again, Rohan, for joining, and over to you, Julien.
Great, thank you, Christoph. Okay, great, thank you. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. Can you all see that? Yeah. Okay. Don't worry too much if you can't see the slides in the room. They're really just words. So, you'll see I'm not very talented with visualization, so I don't even try. Anyway, I just wanted to start by asking you to think about home, just a tiny little word, home. So what are your associations with it? What do you see? Do you see the inside of a flat? Do you see a house? Do you see a garden, a street? Do you see several streets? Do you see a park, a cafe, a whole neighborhood? Or do you think maybe of a country? Maybe it's the country of your birth, if, like me, it's not the one that you're currently living in. Or do you think as home of home as origins? Do you think of it as something that you choose in the present, something that you have or you don't have? Do you think of home as immaterial? Do you think of home as cultural aspects? Do you think of home as food or flavors or smells, sounds? Do you think of it as something you might miss when you're abroad? Do you think of it as a landscape, or do you think of it as a palette of colors? Just home. Do you think of it as your family, parents, siblings, friends, lovers? And you can see I'm picking things from Lovely Villa as well here. So what is home? And home, I think, is usually linked to quite positive emotions. It's triggers joy, it triggers happiness, but then sometimes it can also bring up sadness and melancholy or trauma. And if there's anyone in the room or anyone online for it where that happened, then I'm sorry about that. But as Jean-Marie once wrote in an essay called "How Much Home Does One Need?" only those who have their home feel no need for it. And Ambedkar, for those who don't know him, was a Jewish Austrian writer who was forced into exile when the Nazis came to power. And this sentence I find really interesting because it made me realize that when we think of home, or the people who think most about home are those who've lost it, been displaced. So they are exiles and refugees of war, of climate change, of economics, even of changing times. And I think this matters because, and I say this as neutrally as I can, when we think of home through a forced loss, then that very easily pushes us into nostalgia, into imagined versions of the past. And then that leads to home as defined ex negativo, home as not where you are now. So home is not often thought of in terms of the positive by the people who have it. And that's what I want to explore a bit more in this talk as well. So this is my talk, vision of home. But the main question is, what makes home? So remember what you thought about earlier, and probably for you all, it includes a combination of things I mentioned, of things that I didn't mention. But I think, or I would hazard a guess that for most of you, if not all of you, home is a place, a specific place that you have in mind, a place to which you might feel some attachment, a place, I would say, that is part of your identity. And Rohan's film, Lovely Villa, which I hope you've all watched. If not, I'm going to put some quotes, but I would highly recommend that you do, because to me, it is about this very idea. And Rohan says, home makes us as we make it. So home makes us. And I think to understand this, I've come from the idea of home as a place. So to me, home is a place. And that might seem banal to say, but you frequently read things like home is not a place. There's a book that came out just recently that's titled exactly that. But to me, it's a place, and it requires a bit of thinking about place. So place is a word that has many meanings, especially when we're in academic circles like this. But when I talk about place, I mean a topological concept of place. So I'm not thinking of Doreen Massey, of David Harvey, or of Nigel Thrift, for whom place seems to be a flow and a purely social construct. I take place as something that is both material and immaterial, but is also necessarily bounded. So to me, it's the boundaries themselves that give meaning. And I use this concept because, as the philosopher Jeff Malpass says, place is not encountered in experience, but rather it is the foundation of experience. So place precedes us, it pre-exists. And Rohan again says something interesting in this regard. He says, home is the stage and the theater. So it's where we act, where we operate. And then he also says something really interesting in the film. He said, the ghosts of where I grew up haunt all the designs I made in architecture school. The ideal life for me was the one I had lived. So home makes him, home makes us. It's the foundation of experience. And so it's also the source of identity. And that's why I think it matters so much to think about home, to think about it positively, to think about its importance, and then to understand what home actually is. So Jean-Marie is an interesting case in this, again, because he supports this notion of place and identity. So his real name, if you didn't know, is Hans Meyer. But then after the war, much after the war, when he was still in Belgium, first as an exile, then gradually finding himself, he changed his name to Jean-Marie. And that's the French version of his first name, and it's an anagram of his surname. And that to me is a telling act, because it conveys that displaced from his home in Austria, he's no longer quite himself. His identity is lost, but then recovered differently in the Belgian context. And so Hans Meyer is reflected as Jean-Marie in the context. So home gives identity because home is the place of belonging. And that is home as a communal rather than an individual identity. It's not just the self, there's a whole community involved. But then this connection of identity and place has been very contested throughout history, especially recent history, and for good reason, because the idea of home, and especially when we think about the protection of home, or home as something closed, that has been appropriated for very nefarious ends. But to think of boundaries and belonging necessarily leads us to a concept of us and them. But that doesn't need to be us versus them. Boundaries can be permeable. The us can be open. The they can be friends. It needn't be in opposition. And what I'm trying to say is that I think we must be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater when we think of these things, because home is too important a human need to leave to a reactionary, nativist, and xenophobic right wing. So again, what is home? You'll have guessed that I'm operating on quite a conceptual plane here. I'm not talking about the English word home, where it usually suggests a house or a flat, a specific abode. Perhaps it's one's parents' house or flat, where you spent your youth. Perhaps it is the place where you were born. And it'll be interesting to hear from people in the room, from people online, especially people who are not of a British or a Western European context, what you mean by home. But when I say home, I'm talking about the German concept of Heimat, as thought of by the philosopher Martin Heidegger. Now, Heimat is quite a complex term, very rich, and it would take a whole lecture to just explain that one. But briefly put, it can be described as a geographically anchored notion of belonging that bestows identity through a shared landscape or a shared place. And Landschaft in German is actually as much the landscape as we might think of it in English, as it is the culture and the people. As a brief aside, Heidegger is a very controversial figure. I probably don't need to say that. He had connections with the Nazi party. He was an anti-Semite. But again, I think here, baby and bathwater applies. And what I'm trying to do a lot in my work is to separate the thinker from the person. And if you're interested in that, I'm giving a talk about it on Thursday. So that can be something to come along as well. But why I'm using Heidegger is because of his fundamental philosophy of existence, the Dasein. So Dasein is being in the world. Just briefly to explain that, Heidegger says that authentic experience can only happen within a specific context and in relation to others. So the world precedes the self, or rather, the self cannot be thought of separately from the world that it operates in. So that's exactly the opposite of Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am. Heidegger says, no, you are in a specific context, and that shapes you. As Edward Casey sums it up, to live is to live locally, and to know is, first of all, to know the place one is in. So home is the place of belonging. And if that is true, then to ever fully be oneself, one must begin the process of learning one's own place. So home begins outside the self. And I think that's a really important realization. So I'm going to let it sink in, and I'm going to say it again. Home begins outside the self. Identity is bestowed from the outside. Now, I mentioned the necessity of boundaries before, and boundaries are what delimits, so literally what defines a place. And for Heidegger, and coming to the end of the sort of context setting, for Heidegger, the boundaries of Heimat are a gathering fourfold, as he calls it. They're earth, sky, mortals, and deities. Now, very briefly, earth is the material space, the physical here, whereas sky is the space through time, the duration that we might spend in it. It's attention to detail and to the changes, and that's often experienced poetically, and that's important, and we'll come back to that. And it's interesting here, again, what Rohan says about terraces in his film, that they are an openness to the blessings of the sky. There's this connection of earth and sky happening. Then mortals, third element, is quite a weird one, but it's a finality that makes particular. So Heidegger's basically saying that because we are mortal, our experience is always situated and specific. We're embodied, and so we are here. And it's this ephemerality that makes this place this person, this room, etc. So specific. And finally, the fourth one is gods, or more accurately, deities. And that can be understood as the ethos of a place. So Yifu Tuan calls that the established values. They're often told in folklore, or they can be told in statues as well. And that brings us full circle, because that is a material manifestation of a value of an immaterial element. Now, it would take much more time to explain this all in detail, but I hope that gives you enough of an idea of where I'm coming from. And because we're a group primarily here of architects and people who design places, I'll focus on the element of earth. So to be at home is to know the earth intimately. And this can be quite literal, especially when we think about in rural regions, where it's an attunement to non-human species as much as anything else. So it's also much more easily understood, I think, in a small village that probably changes much more slowly and can be recognizable throughout one's life, for example. There, the earth is much more tangible, but I think that applies in the same way to the urban environment. Knowing the earth is knowing the particularities of each individual house or flat. It's learning the names of streets and parks and everything else around it. And that's the official names and the nicknames. It's mapping the crossroads, mapping the cul-de-sacs, mapping cut-throughs, knowing shortcuts. It's adapting one's route to changing conditions. So I often think of taxi drivers in London who know all the streets and everything. And I'm sure many of us have felt that disorientation of being away from home, of not having that knowledge, that intimate connection to it. And conversely, moving somewhere, I'm sure many of us have experienced those delicious little moments when your mental map fills in, when this gray area suddenly becomes colored in, when you realize that there's a street that leads to one that you already know. But then the earth is also made by the community. So desire lines, which I know are a very hackneyed cliche, but to me are still a very powerful image. Or, walls with graffitis taking over the space. It can be a community garden with flowers and vegetables, all of these things that we make as a group. And then, of course, and that's where we sort of begin to leave the element of earth, but there are memories that are inherent in each space. And they come down through generations. They can be revived in rituals, and then they can change as the palimpsest is inscribed with another layer. So imagine a space without memories. How disorientating would that be? How bland, how unhomely, how uncanny, actually, as Freud says, unheimlich, unhomely. And this brings me to another line in Rohan's film. Every year, the grounds around the caves are sites for celebrations and assertions of identity, earth and identity. And I wonder what identity he means here. It's certainly communal. There's no doubt about that. But is it a local identity? Is it a religious identity? Because Christians and Hindu come together, as I understand it. And that's perhaps a question we can discuss later. Anyway, I think hopefully you get the idea. Earth is that shared space in which we can be mortals, in which a community can come together because its experience is shaped and its movements are limited in the same way. And what's also clear, if a place is to be a home, is that we have to reframe the notion of value. When space is commodified, Maria's ears might pop now, all symbolic value vanishes. Memories, openness, shared spaces in which to come together, they tend not to have a value on the market. And even trying to quantify that value is fundamentally wrong because it's a symbolic value. And it's in this that gentrification is a process of slow violence through a displacement in situ almost. Now, in my work, I frequently quote Caleb Femi. He's a poet from South London, and I find his writings fascinating with regards to home in the city. He calls home his ends, and he puts the idea of slow violence neatly. He writes, "We know the pattern of what begets what, as poor kids from the block, able to point out the magic in our bruises, violence in a rose garden." Violence in a rose garden. That's, to me, a very powerful phrase. It highlights the meaning of place and the slow impact of change. Because what uses a rose garden to this community? It's the drastic change of the place. It's someone else's vision of home. It encroaches, it imposes. Now, there are systemic issues at play here, of course, and they're well beyond our cloud. But as designers, as architects, there's a question you can ask. How does this space foster or hinder belonging? So Rohan talks wistfully about the weave of pedestrian lanes that once crisscrossed the colony that were open. There was an interconnectedness that helped people come together, helped them feel part of the same. And then those lanes, he says, are now closed due to security concerns. Did that lead to an atomization of the community? Again, that's a question for later, I don't know. But Caleb Femi, to come back to him, addresses this clash between designers and architects on the one hand and the users of a place on the other. And it's a clash really about who gets to build place. So he writes, the architect maintained that their design was a good solution because of the times. It is true, on paper, there were no designs for a tomb, yet the East Wing stairs where the Damilola was found. This is about the gruesome murder of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor in the North Peckham estate in 2000. Caleb Femi also grew up in that estate. And what he says is that the design of the estate itself, the elevated walkways that disconnect the community from the world, the verticality that even hinders community from coming together, is to be blamed, at least in part, for Damilola's murder. As I said, he calls that the ends, but I think what he's talking about is very similar to Heimat. But for him, it's home in spite of, not helped by design. And to further air his grief, he has another poem that's called A Designer Talks of Home and a Resident Talks of Home. And he sets it up as a transcript of alternating between the two eponymous characters, and immediately you realize there's no dialogue there. There's a complete separation. The designer pompously says things like, empathy is the cornerstone of design. It's about how things feel, smell, as much as they look. That's how they look. But in between, he interjects the resident's real human experience, as it were. And the resident says, there's a wall full of RIPs here. Mum reckons that's why they covered the rot with cladding, because concrete smells like a siege. And it's impossible here not to be reminded of Grenfell Tower, that poorly cladded council estate that burned down in June of 2017, killed at least 72 people, traumatized an entire community and an entire nation, and probably much more beyond it. So we fully get the tragic irony when the designer says, design is a tool to enhance our humanity. But whose humanity are we talking about? The designer says design is a frame for life, for putting human experience at the beginning of the process. And it becomes clear that Femi would prefer to place human experience at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of the design process as well. What he's saying is that participatory design is not a finite process. It's something that is ongoing continuously. And that's because Heimat is an active engagement. It's something that is constantly built and rebuilt by the community. It's never finite, it's never fixed. And that brings me to my final point. Home is made. Rohan says this as well. It's a community was to be made in this colony. And colony, again, is a fascinating word because before it became associated with colonialism, with power, with extraction and exploitation, colony was rather a nice word, actually. It was a group of people who chose to live together, to come together. It comes from the Latin for to till the land, to cultivate. And that to me is great, of course, because it links me neatly back to earth. But it suggests that colony is something that can, but colony as a word suggests that it's something that only the community can build. And that's how I saw the slapstick sketches at the end of Rohan's film. Home is not an individual house. It's not a kit that you can just put up. You know, you can't build it yourself and you can't move it just like that. No, home can only happen through an active engagement with the place that pre-exists and through an active engagement with the other. Home begins outside the self. Rohan asks poignantly, how does one make a home, or rather, how does one leave a home? The old home spilled out of the shell of the new one, eccentric, disturbing. I absolutely love this image. It's so rich and powerful. It suggests that one cannot ever bring one's old home to a new one. It will not fit. The place one moves to exists and cannot be changed at will. When one seeks simply to transfer over the old one, it stands out. One marks oneself out, and this is a disturbing aspect. And that's because homemaking begins with learning. I'll say that again. And that requires an openness to a new place, a sacrifice, as it were, of the old home, at least in part. Because the more one clings to the old, the less one adapts to the new. It always spills out. But at the same time, each member of the community contributes. Each new influence brought to the community actively becomes gradually absorbed. The eccentric moves to the center. Because homemaking stands in contrast to homecoming. Homemaking is forward-facing. So that's what I take away from Lovely Villa. But then the reason why I find it most fascinating and why it connects so well with my own work is the process of making the film itself is homemaking. And I call that home writing. Is to think about home in this way, in the way that Rohan did, in the way that Caleb Femi does, and in the way that hopefully, as suggested, you do as well, forces us to focus on the poetic experience. It requires an attention to what's outside of us, to the detail, to the people, to the memories, and to the beauty. And it's through this kind of poetic worship that we learn to love the place in all its facets, and that we become the place. It's through this that we learn to belong. And so I'll leave you with Caleb Femi's words again, with a message that is meant that what dwelling really means, that this is what being at home perhaps actually means, with an ambition that you may be able to say this about your home without ever feeling the need to defend it. I have never loved anything the way I love the ends. On a good day, I whisper wicked things into its ear, charge the air with electricity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julien, for giving us so much to think about and also to discuss eventually in order to bring together both speakers. I would suggest that we, if you're okay with that, Rohan, perhaps move directly to you, and then we'll have some space for everybody to join the conversation following your talk. That's okay with you, Rohan.
Thank you so much.
Had a hand up. I don't know if it was clarification or discussion.
No.
Yes. Martin,
Sorry.
did you want to say something at this point?
I've done it. Sorry, we didn't hear that. We were both muted.
Oh, okay.
I apologize. I was just trying to clap and I just clicked the wrong hand.
All right.
Apologies.
Okay, so over to Rohan. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julien. That was very moving as a sort of meditation on the idea of home, as well as the film and the way that it kind of thought about the home. And I've created a sort of slideshow-ish thing, which tries to place the film within the concerns that I had and some of the kind of questions that we were really working with, me and my partner Mukul, while we were making the film. So I'm just going to share screen, and hopefully it should work. Yeah. Right. So this, of course, is the title of the film, and Architecture as Autobiography. And I think that title was really important for me, the subtitle, Architecture as Autobiography. Because have always been interested in the relationship between these two terms. And, in your talk, you kept bringing them up. And I was really kind of excited by the possibilities of looking at what this relationship really means when we think about the role of architecture itself. Because I'm interested in the relationship because both of them are embedded in a certain idea of stability, but actually in both are sort of, illusions in some sense, or rather chimera, unstable ideas. Homes are seen as spaces of comfort, but can also be seen as spaces of trauma and imprisonment, like you put it. And identity itself is always a sort of shifting and fragmented idea. It is this I wanted to explore in the films I was making, both Nostalgia for the Future, which is the earlier film that I had done, and Lovely Villa, of course. In both cases, I was really interested in the way architecture becomes an instrument through which we make an identity, we make a home. I was curious about how architecture has been deployed in that sense, in the making, at a political level as well as a personal level, and how both the personal and the political are constantly intertwined. And of course, the idea of communities are all intertwined with one another. One of the metaphors, kind of conceptual frameworks for the film was the kind of idea of the mirror. Um, the image, I've always felt like this idea of the image in a mirror that exists in a sort of elsewhere. It's a sort of place that we recognize ourselves as an idea. Uh, I was interested in the form of that idea that we see in the mirror and the distance that exists from where we are and who we see ourselves as, rather, in that mirror. The image in some way can be seen as a utopian sort of projection of who we desire to become, and the acts that we make, the acts that we do, including architecture, become a way in which we try and enter that space. However, the image in the mirror constantly moves away and apart from where we are. Another way in which I was interested in the mirror is a sort of metonymic way, the way in which a part begins to represent a whole. So there's a constant mirroring of one idea into the other, into a larger scale. I guess things like that will become clearer as I kind of explain. I'd like really talk a little bit about what were the ideas that were going through our heads while we were making the films. Both this one, Nostalgia for the Future, and Lovely Villa. And many of the themes of both these films seem to kind of be, resonate with this idea of longing for home, which of course is what the word nostalgia really means. Nostalgia for the Future was an exploration of the relationship between citizenship, the idea of nation, and the architecture of the home. Um, and while Lovely Villa was an exploration of the relationship between the home, architecture, and the making of the self, the idea of identity very clearly. So in some senses, the first film was interested in the identity of citizenship, and the second was interested in the idea of the self and looking at what that relationship is. Um, in this case, in the first imagination of the mirror, there was this idea of the ideal citizen that was supposed to be me, as an Indian citizen. What does it mean to be me on the other side? And architecture, in many ways, was seen as an instrument through which we try and make this Indian citizen. And in the second case, there was the metonymic mirroring that was there between the body of the citizen, the idea of the architecture of the home, the city itself, and the nation, and how each of them seemed to be mirroring ideas across these scales. So it was this sort of mirroring that I was really interested in, and how architecture enables those lines of desire towards the making of that, I guess, image or across on the other side of the river, of the mirror. And I'm really interested in image making, both architectural image making and cinema image making. And one of the things that struck us, me and Mukul, while we were making the film, was how architecture and cinema were both incorporated into the great sort of project of nation building in the early 1950s in the country. These are two quotations by the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, in both cases, he's very clearly saying that both of these disciplines need to participate in encouraging and good taste and help pave the way in the building of a new India. And it's actually something that, we've grown up with. I was born in 1971, and, our economy liberalized in 1992. And in the first 20 years, I grew up in a sort of socialist imagination of the country. And the kinds of ways in which we saw the state was a state that was going to provide housing for us. This is Nehru doing this large exhibition on low-income housing in Delhi, in the 1950s, where there was a certain idea of a humble home that needed to be built for the new citizens themselves. And all of us were supposed to be able to aspire. This was an architecture that became the mode through which we imagined our own senses of identity as well as secular citizens of this new nation. At the same time, film itself was also creating images through this organization, Films Division India, which was creating ideas of who we were meant to be as Indian citizens. Propaganda films that taught us what good manners are, about women's education, about overpopulation. These were the sorts of films that we saw while we were growing up. An idealized Indian citizen was being made for us to be part of the home of the nation. This is the body we were meant to inhabit. We also had films made by the same organization that were interested in homes themselves, and the idea of the home was something that was cheap, easy to build, a shelter for the new for the growing populations of the country. This kind of ethic, I guess, was an important thing for me to think about, in the way that the architectures of homes were used to construct this imagination of the body, or the imagination of the body of the Indian citizen. So what we did is that we looked at 4 different homes built over a period of 100 years in India, and looked at how in each of these homes the body of the citizen was imagined. Yeah. So in the first is a palace in Baroda, where the architecture is a performance of modernity through costuming. The second one is a building by Le Corbusier in Ahmedabad, where you imagine the body to be this sort of free and in nature, naked in nature, without costume. The third is Gandhi Ashram, where the body of the Indian citizen is seen as fundamentally one that can be sinful, and therefore sort of a denial of the body. And the last one was looking at public housing projects, and how citizenship was imagined by public housing projects in Delhi. In fact, the last example is then what leads into housing that we did together. This interest in how the state projected and presented an idea of who we were meant to be through the homes that it built for us. But of course, this imagination always had the idea of kind of subjectivity. I mean, this imagination of who we were meant to be was always at loggerheads with who we actually are. And the body of the subject is often a subjected body, subjected to these imaginations. And the gap between the imagination and realities was also something that we were really interested in exploring. So there was always this sort of tension, or the gap between the of who we were meant to be and who we were. That was of interest to me. And the idea of home seemed to kind of exist within that space as this ice somewhere in the distance on the other side of the mirror, and the idea of the edge and the domain within which and the construction of that towards becoming this ideal Indian citizen. So that's when we started thinking about Lovely Villa. Um, this was a film that was really interested in the exploration of the self. Like, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be an architect? What does it mean to be Indian? Yeah. And over here, what we did is that, on the other side of the mirror, that the thing that we wanted to become is the father as an archetype. The archetype of order, a certain sort of structure that we think is necessary for us to kind of grow into. And all the actions that we make on this side of the mirror is towards the becoming of that father. And this father was metonymically mirrored, like it was in the first film, across different ideas. First, of course, the self itself and the ways in which we imagine the identity of oneself. My father, my father himself. The father figure, in this case, Charles Correa, who was the architect that I aspired to become because of the fact that I grew up in the homes that he designed for us. The nation state itself, and also architecture as an idea of the putting of chaos into order, a certain imagination of order. Another important narrative thing that we were really interested in is this subtitle, which is Architecture's Autobiography, like I said earlier. And really thinking about stories as a structure that we use to make sense of the way we live our lives in the world. story itself as a way in which we architecture rather the life. So architecture becomes a mode of structuring who we are, or structuring the idea of home as well. I mean, you all have seen the film, so I won't kind of dwell too much on this part of the story, which is my family. That is the terrace of lovely villa. That's my father, my sister, my mother, and me sitting on the terrace. My father was an engineer. My mother is a Tamilian, Tamilian from Tamil Nadu. My mother is a Maharashtrian, comes from the state that I am in, Maharashtra. And both Sonal and I, both of us grew up to be architects. Um, my father and my mother, the slides are not moving, okay. They, they actually, it's an interesting thing, this Jeevan Bima Nagar or Life Insurance Corporation colony, because it was an initiative very much by the nation state to make homes for the ideal citizens of India, the city dwellers of India. And they hired Charles Correa to do so. And Charles Correa was really interested in creating, low income but well ventilated, nice housing for people who are urban citizens. And within the architecture itself, which is close to this is Borivali, a suburban railway station. And this is the main road that takes me to the home. This is the large sort of property that was by the LIC. And in this, Korea designed this kind of colony, a ring road, these cul-de-sacs that lead inwards, and strings of homes with green spaces in between. And this was like a large, grove of mango trees that was all at the center. I grew up in this kind of idyllic imagining with terraces and gardens and all of these ideas, very much part of the way that I imagined what it meant to live well. And this began to, affect, like I said in the film, many ways in which I thought of myself, not only as a kind of man, but also in the way that I imagined what it meant to be a citizen. So the idea of the home, metonymically, like in the first film, began with me and the self and the body and, community, city, and the nation, sort of mirroring across. As you know in the film, this was an experiment by the LIC that as soon as they kept paying for their life insurance policies, which is really what they bought, they were really paying for their home. So when the policy matured, the home became theirs, which was a unique and I think never repeated method of delivering low-income housing in India. Yeah. So this is the space I grew up in. Yeah. This is, of course, my mother in the film watching the thing. This is the terrace outside. My father, this is my family again, sitting and watching television and actually posing for a photograph. But my father passed away in 2014, which was a few years back. And that also was a really important thing that began to shape this idea of home for me. The idea of the home as a place for comfort and stability. And with the father's passing, suddenly there are new gaps and new kinds of possibilities that open up. And that was also part of what we were exploring in Lovely Villa. Not just the desire for home, but also what happens when the home begins to disintegrate. What are the sorts of opportunities and possibilities that open up when the idea of order, multiple fathers that we were interested in, begin to disappear. Because at the same time, the nation state itself had begun to disintegrate. The idea of a secular India had begun to disintegrate. And the anxiety that opens up with the loss of home, or rather with the disintegration of home, was central to many of the ideas that emerged in the film itself. So the film was structured with these ideas in mind, and this is really the last part of the presentation. So there were three things I'd like to talk about how the film was made, because the film itself had a sort of architecture that also we wanted to disintegrate in some senses. So if while watching the film, we realize that it has many different voices in the film, and each of these voices, each of the texts really talks about the place in different ways. One is the first historical sort of narratives that is read by Mukul, my boyfriend, who gives the kind of overall imagination, the large scale voice of God, voice of nation, perhaps narrative of the place. He's also the one that actually describes the everyday, along with me and my sister, about what we saw on television, where we used to play, that kind of stuff. Describe it. The other one is a sort of nostalgic imagining, which is pitched as a memory voice or a longing. That is part of it. And the last voice was, I guess I could only call it poetic, where with the with the death of the father, texts begin to overlap, multiple voices begin to speak, fragments begin to enter the text. So the film was structured along these four overlapping ways of seeing the same idea of home. The other I'm interested in is the way that images themselves carry with them, within the texture of the image, memory, and how memory is catalyzed by the texture of an image, not even what the image is showing, but just the texture of the image. So we wanted to use old black and white photographs, color photographs, new cell phone footage, digital footage, GIFs, just as a way of looking at all the different registers of memory that can be used in talking about the idea of home as a memory half accessed through image. And the last bit was really thinking about the breaking of the home or the opening of the home. What happens when the home begins to disintegrate? What happens when death kind of appears, the ruin emerges? And that's really where that last sequence wanted to really refer to. This idea of a perpetual sort of kind of regurgitation of building and breaking over and over again, where the home is always provisional, and although the idea stays as a perpetual longing, it's something that we're constantly building with material ideas towards the making of that idea of home. I was thinking of this philosopher called Ernst Bloch and his idea of the spirit of utopia as something that always exists in the horizon, somewhere far in the horizon. And we are constantly trying to get to that horizon with the things that we do. And the idea of home or the idea of identity lies somewhere on that horizon. Identity is always made by the way that we perform within our everyday lives. And the home is also something that we long for through what we make, through the photographs that we collect, through the buildings that we make, through the clothes that we wear. And these material facts can never really get to that image behind the mirror. And that gap is really where possibilities open up. For me as a gay man, the home has always been something that, the idea of home, the heteronormative imagination of home, has always been something that lies on the other side, is something that simultaneously I long for, but simultaneously that repels me because it comes with a certain value system that I have very ambivalent, to say the least, feelings about. And that's really what I hope that this film, Lovely Villa, is about. I think I'll stop there. Was I too long? Maybe I was.
Thank you very much, Rohan. So that was a very rich presentation. I think there are many notes that people have been taking here on campus. I think there was also lots of resonance. I thought the idea of the four voices, of being multivocal, constructing the film out of those voices, very much like a piece of architecture. Julien was talking about the fourfold, looking at those four complementary aspects. So I think that's quite a rich territory. But perhaps rather than asking a question, I would like to open this up to the floor or to the panel. So we're actually joined by colleagues from many different backgrounds and disciplinary knowledges. I'm checking. So please raise your hand for a question or add to the chat. I think ideally perhaps raising your hand and asking the question directly would be wonderful. See, we're joined by colleagues from English literature, from filmmaking. Yeah.
Thank you, Rohan. That was super interesting, and yeah, a lot of overlap also, sort of different approaches to it, which I find very great.
Christoph, could you mute, because I'm getting too many voices when I'm listening here.
Right, is it better now?
Yeah, way better. Yeah.
Great. I was really interested in your sort of death of the father image, and both sort of literal in your case, in my case as well, actually, and the metaphorical one, and how it leads. So I wonder, because to me you seem to describe, you know, like overlap, fragments, a kind of disorder, kind of chaos that emerged. So how do you then overcome that? Do you sort of recreate a new home, or do you do away with the need for home? And what is this new home like?
Yeah, no, I think that's exact. I think that's one of the reasons why we played that last clip. If you've seen the end, we played thrice. Where the breaking of the home at the end happens thrice, because I don't think one can ever escape the longing for home, or even the desire for home, or even the presence of home. In my head, it's always something that we have to make over and over again. It will at some point begin to disintegrate, and then one has to kind of in many ways reconstruct it. In that sense, I think what I'm trying to say is that we are always making one, constantly. Does that answer you, Julien? Actually, I can't see you because
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why I think it's so important to think about home, because it is such a fundamental thing that we can't really escape. But then what I found myself thinking about more and more is how little control we have over it as a self, because there is so much beyond us that plays into it. And that's where that limitation, I think, is really interesting, and how to deal with that limitation. I find it fascinating.
I think, you know, I like the idea of making very much, because the acts of making are always the deployment of one's resources that one has towards an idea that can never be really captured. And I think there's always that sort of gap that emerges where new possibilities can perhaps emerge in those gaps. The thing is, you know, so that's, I mean, that's why, I mean, I really felt that your presentation, with its sort of imagination of Heimat, with the idea of the material, or what you call the earth, as this kind of thing that we're constantly working through, perpetually trying to find that sense of centeredness, was very beautiful.
I don't want to hog the floor there, so.
I might just perhaps if I may come back to your mention of Ernst Bloch and the idea of utopia. I think Ernst Bloch wrote this book, the Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope, and then also around this comparison of Caleb Fehmi's poetic response to Peckham, and I think your equally poetic response through images to Charles Correa and to LSE housing, with, I think, perhaps in both cases a certain tension between a home that is being planned by an architect, that is being constructed for a new citizen. I think probably in both cases, I think also in the UK, there's this notion in the post-war Labour government that there would be a new citizen emerging from the war. And then I think just now you said something about new things emerging from gaps, and maybe also your critique of this very normative system that underpins a lot of architectural design, this idea of the nuclear family and this idea of a very prescribed lifestyle. So I was just maybe curious in maybe asking you both to comment a little bit more on this kind of tension and on this perhaps, yeah, on homes that are designed and homes that somehow emerge from gaps, from interactions, from inhabitation, and maybe many different things. So it's a question for both of you, and maybe
Julien, you
Rohan,
want
I
to go
think you're
first?
muted.
Oh, sorry. Am I muted? It doesn't show muted. Can you hear me? No.
That's one.
Maybe just use
Yes. So sorry, we have two channels, which makes it all a bit complicated. So hopefully now it should all be good. You can't see me
Can you
anymore
hear me
because I'm now.
now?
Oh my God.
It's like, yeah, okay, cool.
But you're
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
speak, so
No, Julien, you go first. Or maybe, I don't know. I actually have lost track of the question with all this movement. So I'm going to try and remember. Yeah. If it, like, I think, I find this idea of the gap, the a fairly interesting space. Actually, maybe it's a queer thing, that who you are and who you present yourselves to be. The idea of the costume itself as an empowering imagining rather than one that is restricting. The ability to play parts that queering allows you to do, costuming allows you to do, the mask allows you to do. And how the mask in many ways is both an enabler as well as a disabler. It allows me to perform in a certain way. It allows me to claim an identity that perhaps is not mine, to play act the home perhaps. I find these to be incredible possibilities of the way that one can make a home. I am not comfortable with the idea of the home as one that exists as a sort of essence, rather, as if there is such a thing as an essential identity and an essential home. Because this very imagination of the essence itself would deny the possibilities of the queer. And I think you see that in the very often in the ways that queer communities begin to perform or participate in the world. They create new modes of homes and families. They perform in drag. There are ways in which they claim identities and claim homes through performance, through making. And sometimes those performances are imitations or almost sometimes parodies of homes, of houses, of heteronormative modes, perhaps. And I think, I find that to be a liberating imagination. And in that gap, you are able to then play with the image. You're able to claim identities through image. You're able to make homes in the ways that you want to. So I feel like, at least for me, the acknowledgement of the gap and the world in the gap, rather than it being something that is necessarily restrictive, or you feel displaced by, also opens out the idea for performing a home of your choosing, perhaps.
yeah, really interesting and really interesting question. I'm muting speakers, but we'll get there. I found the question it opened up so many things that is important. Yeah, I won't be able to go into. But it made me think of. There's one thing that I was trying to say about participatory design not being a starting point, but something that keeps going, because it is a constantly remade. And if we sort of think, okay, we can include participation at the start and then have a finished product, and then that's completely fixed, then ultimately we're imposing on somebody, because things change. But then it also made me think about what we talk about when we talk about identity, whether we're talking about the self, about the individual, or whether we're talking also about something communal. And an identity, I find quite an interesting word. Unfortunately, I've sort of like gone down Heidegger's route of etymology and questioning words, but because identity we use as something to prove our absolute individuality. So it's the way we prove that we are who we are. But at the same time, identity also means equality. So something is identical with. And so that's where I think the interesting bit of self and community. So how much do we share? How much is common ground? And how much is ourself? And it made me think about architecture in Britain or in London, sort of that, for whatever economic reasons it was done in that way, but this sort of like completely uniform, everything identical from the outside, where it's sort of like almost rude to be ostentatious. You know, you can't show anything about yourself on the outside. Everything is done behind the doors. So there's this sense of the public persona and the private persona acting. And yeah, so there's quite a lot in that question, I thought, but too much to really unpack.
Yeah. Now I was really reminded of Judith Butler's kind of gender trouble and the way she imagines identity, which she always says that identities only exist within performances and they are retroactively then imposed on somebody. So this idea of performance and act and the acts of making, I think, are really interesting. And yeah. Yes.
But I thought that actually also came through. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Should be.
I think it also came through in the way that you framed the film, which I thought it was incredible that you actually wove together life, architecture, landscape, stories, anecdotes, the four voices that you provided in I think what is very unusual for a film about a place or about architecture, where often the architecture gets reified or objectified, and maybe then those possibilities, those gaps get foreclosed by focusing so much on the vision of the architect and the building as an object. So I thought that actually was for me in maybe the most interesting film about architecture in that way, that it didn't foreground architecture and it opened up those possibilities. I thought it was incredibly powerful as a way of speaking about architecture. Maybe if I can just add something quite architectural, I was quite interested also in maybe the quite offhand way in which you described the Charles Correa's idea of the terrace open to sky, the tube housing. And I think that's really interesting that to see that you showed the section through the luxury high-rise in Mumbai, which had the same idea of the tube, their villas, and this whole idea you could actually play with the theme, I think, as you have done also with the urban and the architecture. And I think he plays with the theme across very different income groups. So he does the same theme for very poor people, and it's very minimal, and he does it for a luxury apartment. And I think that's something that I also admired very much, this idea that you can actually, as an architect, somehow transcend those boundaries. So maybe to end with, or to have a bit of a question, I was quite curious, because we were so positive about Charles Correa and the experience of growing up there. And then I think Caleb Fehmi is rightfully very skeptical about the utopia that the post-war Labour government tried to create through council estates and all of that. So I was just wondering on these kind of, is it Charles Correa? Is it this architectural sophistication that you think made the LSC housing a success, or do you think it's more the social mix, the demographics, the interactions? And I just was a bit curious where you see the role of the architect.
I think that Korea was really instrumental in a certain way in which Indian citizenship was imagined. I mean, it was imagined as secular. It was imagined as one where the rich and poor would live together. So, and the LIC, the Life Insurance Corporation, had created a financial model and a method of making that created that sort of mix. So there was a sort of
We might have lost. Is there anyone else still here? Have we lost ourselves?
I
think it's
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Back, yeah. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah.
Hey. Yeah. Because I lost, I mean, the internet went for like a second or so. So I think there wasn't, but that's not to say that very often when the state, I mean, most often when the state built housing for its urban citizens, it did it in the most atrocious way. In fact, that was what was explored in our earlier film, which was Nostalgia for the Future, is that it was badly built often with terrible sorts of infrastructure, terrible sort of, services. Um, One thing I must say though, that Korea himself wasn't particularly happy with the LIC colony, the one that I grew up in. Once when I had met him, I'd asked him, I told him actually that, Charles, he liked to be called by his first name. I said, Charles, I grew up in LIC colony. He said, oh, the one in Borivali. I said, yes, the one in Borivali. And then he said, my condolences to you. So it was, he absolutely kind of hated that colony. On the other hand, his daughter, who runs the Charles Korea Foundation right now, Nandita Korea Mehrotra, she has become particularly fond of it because it does represent a large housing colony for middle class families that he did design. And that is, in many ways, a nice place to be. This kind of model was never repeated really. So in many ways, it is a unique example in the country of this kind of housing. And Korea, yes, Korea was able to give shape to that imagination, for better or worse. Many his buildings are not perfect by a long shot. They leak often because of the way that he refuses to give, rain, kind of chajas, as they say in India. Um, and some of the flats are ridiculously small. In some you have to walk through the kitchen to get to the living room. It's all kind of awkward stuff. But at the end of it, I think what was interesting for me about the colony was its aspirations. It had a certain aspiration, uh, a certain idea that I wanted to explore and also dismantle at the end. What happens actually in the 90s is that this very idea that the state can provide housing, the idea of the nation state that needs to kind of care for its citizens itself begins to dismantle. Imaginations of citizenship are replaced by imaginations of consumerism, and the consumer becomes the one that we are really interested in catering to. And with that, and that actually happens almost at the same time that the idea of the secular Indian state is also under threat. I mean, with the Hindu-Muslim riots that happen in Bombay or across the country. So that idea of the nation state, the idea of the home, architecture, citizenship, all begins to change dramatically in the mid-90s. And that's where the death of the father business also begins to overlap with the idea of the nation state.
So Rohan, we have a question in the chat from Holly Antrim. Holly, would you like to ask the question yourself, or?
She said her mic wasn't working, but maybe it is now.
Okay, I will read it. That's okay. So Holly's question is a few notes. Rather, she's making a few notes. Before seeing the film, I'm interested in the notion of the disintegration of home as a natural life cycle. It puts nostalgia in a different space somehow. Perhaps an acceptance that spaces may change as do the people. Also, the tactility I've seen in the film, in the first few minutes of the film. Thanks. And I've also been to Villa Shodan and Gandhi's ashram in Ahmedabad. Very interesting to hear from both speakers in those two disciplines. And I think she says that she will think about Heimat in her archival research. And I think, Holly, you're making a film about a Czech person is looking at identity through quite complex lenses that I won't dare to somehow summarize now. I would be very scared to do that. But I think as a filmmaker, you've been looking at the notion of identity as well. So do you have a question to Julien and Rohan as well? Or?
I feel like,
So
although
when-
you can hear me, I still need to speak to you in mine.
I think what's interesting on that point, Holly and Heimat, is, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the space, so architecture, and how architecture itself sort of communicates ideas of citizenship, ideas of identity that are to be embraced. But what I find really interesting in the notion of Heimat is how it reframes displacement. And I think Rohan was beginning to talk about that in sort of the commercialization, the commodification of space, and the neoliberal. I mean, that seems to like almost also change place through the symbolic, through the values, through the things that are not necessarily the physical space, even though that's also reflected in how we build or don't build social housing, communal housing in that way. But that also creates, and maybe that's what you meant by it reframes nostalgia, it sort of changes the place around us in situ almost without really noticing it. And that, to me, has also sort of reframed this notion of reactionary, and I'm trying to excuse that, but it explains it much more to me, this rise of something to grasp. You know, if we think of it in the death of the father, which creates chaos and disorder, then if all of this sort of is eroded, then we're left in that space of fragment of chaos, and people are just frantically trying to rebuild. Some of them are grasping to the nostalgic, which is what I'm saying is a misconception of home, is a trying to go back to something that was imagined instead of trying to focus on the now and the future. And then Bloch says Heimat is actually not the past, but the future. It's that principle of hope and of coming together in utopia. So anyway, that was a ramble. I don't know if it helped in any way, and you can't even see me. I'm here, but
Yeah.
So this has been a super rich conversation. And so thank you very, very much, Rohan, for so generously giving us your time and your thoughts. And I hope it's not it's the beginning of a conversation, I'm hoping. So I think we are all taking a lot home with us from the conversation. And I think hopefully can somehow continue when there are chance opportunities. So I think unless there's any direct question to ask, perhaps this is the moment to say a big thank you to both speakers, and also especially to you, Rohan, for being so generous with your time and your ideas. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure talking about the film with you guys. It's very rare that I get to really, spend a long. I mean, the fact that Julien saw the film and responded to it, I feel very privileged to be actually part of this conversation. Thank you so much. I'd love to kind of have more conversations with all of you. So feel free to contact me. I'm more than willing to. I would love to actually talk more. Whether that's in, by email, Instagram, wherever, I'm always there.
Thank you very much for offering. And I also we have Sandeep here in the UK as our human bridge between Manchester, Mumbai, and London. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much once again.
thanks everyone.
Thanks, Sandeep. I can't see it though. It's okay. Bye, Sandeep. Bye. Bye.